So good afternoon, everyone. If you could take your seats, and I think it would be great if those of you in the back could come forward, so that we don't have to yell into the microphones, and we'll be able to hear you if you have a question to ask. If it comes to that, so if you can, so please come to the front. It's way too big a venue for this event, but there it is. So welcome this afternoon to this session of the Conference on World Affairs, titled "Unfair Trade. Is America First Putting Us Last?" That's a couple of different concepts. I'm not sure they're closely related, but we'll see what the panel thinks to say about that. My name is Keith Maskus. I'm a professor of economics here at the university. And just so you know, I came back just a few months ago from having spent 12 months as the chief economist of the US State Department. So let me introduce the panel then today. First we have to my left, Jose De La Fuente, who has had a long career in government finance in Chile, and then a stellar career in business working with firms in Chile and Venezuela, and now has a consulting firm that works with companies to build trade links in the United States. To his left is Ross Wilson, former ambassador to Turkey and to Azerbaijan, 30-year career in the State Department with some very high-level positions in the State Department, and now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Next is Henry Nau, who's a professor of international relations and political science at George Washington University. Also had a long and distinguished career at the US State Department as a senior diplomat in economic affairs. A very well-known analyst of international relations now. And then last is Reza Ramazani, who's a professor of economics at St. Michael's College and a PhD graduate of this institution some time ago. And a longtime panelist at the Council on World Affairs, the Conference on World Affairs. He's an expert on international relations with Iran and the Middle East. So with that, I'd like to just ask each of the panelists to offer 10 minutes or so of their own views in that order, and then we'll open it up to discussion amongst themselves and then take questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I mean, first, I'm a citizen of Chile, so it's kind of exciting to be in this panel, but my views really has to be our perception of how we see things going on in the current United States foreign policy and trade policies. So I think that one thing to put things in context, I was looking and said, well, what do we really mean by being America first? And thinking on that basically was, some 10, I would say, big items. 2018, U.S. will reach energy dominance to larger production than Saudi Arabia. Strong national defense and foreign policy, trade deals for American prosperity, ending job-killing regulations, choice in education, rebuild America's infrastructure, tax reforms, and repeal and replace Obamacare. So, I think that some of these you can do checks, others half checks, and others probably, not there yet. But I think when it comes to our position, obviously, you see this situation that you have with China today, which is the talk of the day. And, on my point of view, I think is that obviously Mr. Trump has decided to play the hardball effect, and we have seen that in all the negotiations he's done so far. With North Korea first, I mean, we have a big deal, and then things tend to calm down, and he finally gets his way. So I think with China it's the same thing. I mean, the way we look at it, by starting this discussion, we're putting in danger almost 1.3 million jobs in the U.S. in different related industries that he's touched, and China is touching back in retaliation. So actually that's the base of his electorate. So I'm sure that, you need to take that into consideration, thinking that this is really a negotiating tactics, and it's really not going to carry forward the way that it's going. This is my point of view, obviously. And I think that the other point I want to touch is also how we see it in Latin America, which is obviously my deeper field of expertise and experience. And I think that today you find that, United States has been an ally to Latin America in many ways for many years. But probably in the last 30 years, we have lost a lot of connections with the United States in the sense, let's keep away the subject of NAFTA and all that, but in general as a region, I think in the past, all the phone companies were owned by American companies. AT&T was a prevailing company there. Sheraton was the prevailing hotel chain. American Airlines, that time, Pan Am and Eastern and all those, the only airlines that used to fly down there were U.S. airlines. Banks, Citibank, the Chase Manhattan Bank, were all the prevailing banks, international banks in the area. All that has been retracting gradually, and today, these countries have built links a lot more with European companies. So you have power distribution now being done by European companies. You have the phone companies owned by the Spanish telephone company, and that's not just in one country, it's throughout the region. So the US have somewhat managed to cover his close front, so Mexico through NAFTA and Canada, and for Latin America with Mexico. Has built links with some friendly countries in Latin America. So obviously there's built similar NAFTA agreements with countries like Colombia in a way to bring support there and try to cut the drug trafficking trade. Then brings links to Peru, and then eventually with Chile, which has managed to have a more stable economy, and probably today Chile is one of the better benefits of agreements with the US when it comes to the extension of trade, having a free trade agreement, plus we have an immigration agreement, and we have an ease of travel between the US and Chile is the only country in Latin America today have a visa waiver program, so that allows all Chilean tourists to come to the US without having to have a previous visa, only an authorization that you can do on internet. But this obviously, US used leverage to get that, and that was probably, we had to comply with a lot of pharmaceutical IP registrations that probably were not being adequately covered in the past. And through this trade agreement, that was covered. And US companies felt that they were initial protection to their IP capabilities. So there is openness, there's his carrying forward. But I think that today, we see a lack of involvement in Latin America, in the sense that first we see that he has decided to cut support to countries like Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, where he's cutting 40% of the aid to some of these countries, 30% to Honduras and El Salvador. Basically money that's been supporting social programs there, that's been supporting development agreements between those countries. So obviously this creates a sense of lack of support, involvement, interest. His latest news was that he's not going to go to the America Summit, something that's been held since 1994, which is a summit where really the US has always taken the prevailing role and the leadership role. And I think we needed that at this point, and it was a high expectation that he would go to this meeting, because somebody has to put up a stop, just like it did to North Korea, to Venezuela. And nothing has been very efficient trying to regiment Venezuela's case. He's having an election, but nobody's going to recognize that election because the president is doing it on his own way. So there is a role. I think that some of these things have come from prior governments. He's kept some of them, but he's definitely short-tailing his relationship with Latin America. And I think that this is just building roads for us as Latin American countries to be covered by Chinese investments. Today, most of the capital goods, like mining equipment, instead of coming from Caterpillar, is coming from a Chinese company. Ships, containers, all that stuff is coming from Asia and a lot from China. So a lot of this investments in infrastructure, capital goods, are being covered by countries like China that are very interested to build bridges to Latin America. And US, with a lack of my point is really not understand if it's really true foreign policy on the government or the lack from the industry in the US to have build these links, because it always is, there is a link between private sector and the government. So I'll leave you with those thoughts and definitely look forward to some of your questions on this.
Does this work? Good. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to this session on unfair trade that I think is intended to look at trade, trade policy, and at least in some form the trade strategies that the United States is currently engaged in. This is the coveted after lunch speaking slot that the four of us have, and to enliven things, I wanted to have a little audience participation at the outset. So we're talking about trade policy, and so forth. Let me just ask for a show of hands. Aside from you, Henry, who here has ever been a trade negotiator? Very good. Who's negotiated a trade? Come on. Bought a car, bought a house, shopped for rugs in Istanbul? Yes, of course you have. Who here lost a job or knows somebody that lost a job because of trade? I get quite a few more hands when I do this in the Minneapolis area. Who here got a job or knows somebody who got a job because of trade or because of a foreign investment? Looking around, it's a roughly equal number of hands in this crowd. Who here buys imports? Who's happy about that? Who thinks it's pernicious? A few. Who thinks it's maybe some of both? Trade is one of those subjects in which all of us have experience at a certain level. That kind of makes us experts, just like we're experts on education because we all went to school, right? And we're all touched by trade. And we're all touched by a dramatic change in the world of trade as it affects the United States that's taken place. I look around the room, there are quite a few people of our age. In our lifetimes, 1960, trade accounted for 9% of American GDP. 9%. Today, or in the recent years anyway, 28, 29, 30% of American GDP. A huge change that's produced all kinds and continues to produce all kinds of changes, adjustments, difficulties in the American economy, and especially for Americans. Combined with perceptions about globalization, trade seeming to take away jobs, to transform our societies in some important ways for the worse. Faceless corporations seeming through trade agreements and by other means to rig the national and international economy to their benefit. Multilateral institutions like the WTO seeming to be able to, making rules and passing judgments that our governments seem powerless to affect. And on top of that, we seem to be losing $500 billion deficits each year over the past number of years, peaked in excess of $700 billion a few years ago. But that 500 is a good recent average. Looks like something's wrong. Something's wrong in America's trade policy. Something's wrong in the trade strategies that past administrations have pursued. Anxiety, fear, anger over change, over injustices associated with trade and with globalization. Long lasting, it's been going on for a number of years. Bipartisan, a big part of the Democratic Party, a significant part of the Republican Party, and in particular our president campaigned on some of these same issues I just referred to. And arguably, the outcome of the 2016 election owes itself to a number of things, but one of the important ones, I think, is Americans' anger over, or anger in a lot of parts of America over what they see in their country getting the shaft in international trade. I want to talk a little bit about China and a little bit about NAFTA and conclude with some thoughts about American policy. And we can elaborate on some of those in the discussion. So China, obviously an emerging great power on the global stage and in particular in the economic realm. Consistent large trade surpluses with the United States and many other countries, more or less since it joined, or shortly after anyway, it joined the WTO in 1999. China with aggressive economic and trade policies that by design or by effect are inflicting harm on the competitiveness of American industry and on industries of a number of our important allies, distorting the international economy, contradicting what China committed to with us and with others when it joined the WTO. So, China provides subsidized financing to key sectors of its economy, in a number of respects violating commitments it made to join the WTO. Strategic use of import barriers to protect industries in violation of its WTO commitments. Forced transfers of technology and or theft of technology in violation of its WTO commitments. Restriction of exports, particularly of rare earths, in violation of its WTO commitments. Violations of global patent rules, unfulfilled WTO accession commitments related to trade liberalization, access to foreign banks to the Chinese economy, and a commitment to join the WTO Global Government Procurement Agreement, perhaps not the most important piece. It's important and it's right that the administration works now to continue to expand and to toughen the efforts that have been going on in the administration of President Bush's two predecessors to try to go after these things and fix them. The tools are a bit of a sledgehammer that you pound down on the target, but in the process you kind of bang on your own foot. And many of us have used a sledgehammer to exactly that effect, and we know how good it feels. Putting at risk a tariff war, putting at risk important American markets in China, for example, civil aviation, a huge American export to China and a sector we want to remain dominant in, or agriculture, very important out where I live. I read a piece recently in the Minneapolis paper, soybeans, which I've visualized or seen, and how this has grown in rows. The plants are grown in rows. 1 out of every 3 rows nationwide goes to China. That's absolutely fascinating. Uncertainties created for tens of billions of dollars in American investment in China that now faces a set of political headwinds as a result of what's going on. Potentially higher prices for American consumers, both individual consumers and also the buyers of Chinese products or Chinese intermediate goods that are put into our manufacturers at a time when our job market is tightening, the first signs of inflation starting to emerge may have some impact. As I look at what the administration is doing, the approach makes sense to the extent that it's embedded in clearly thought through strategies on 3 fronts: our global trade strategy, our China strategy. We need China's help on a few of the hot button issues in the world, and pissing them off carries a lot of risks, I think particularly in North Korea, and our China trade policy, 3 separate pieces. Little real evidence, at least from the outside, about what that strategy is. There's clearly some bargaining going on, but how these pieces are envisioned fitting together with one another is unclear, and the sometimes dysfunctional or at least hopscotch nature of this administration's decision-making and thought process and consistent implementation of the decisions that it makes, raising a lot of questions. And on top of that, what we're doing is unilateral. It's the United States. Instead of working with other affected countries and through a WTO context. Maybe this will work out. China has lots of vulnerabilities. and it has 1,001 reasons not to want a trade war with the United States. We'll see how it goes. Very briefly on NAFTA, the worst deal ever. On a macro level, NAFTA's impact has been quite a bit less than meets the eye. Trade among the three countries has tripled since it went into effect in 2003. The Peterson Institute estimates that its cumulative impact on American wealth amounts to $127 billion that you can identify with NAFTA. That's $5.5 billion a year, averaged out over those number of years. We have an $18 trillion economy. NAFTA's global or macro impact for the United States quite minimal. Peterson also estimates on the job loss department, 330,000 jobs lost, net loss. Some jobs gained, some jobs lost. 330,000 net loss, 15,000 a year. Since 2001, 5 million jobs have been shed in the retail sector, 270,000 jobs in the newspaper sector. 15,000, obviously a big deal if you're one of those people. Winners, losers. We'll see how these talks go. Very tough bargaining on the part of the administration. To the extent it works to modernize the NAFTA agreement, it will be pushing more or less on an open door, but very tough bargaining. I've more than used up my time, so we can come back to U.S. policy, and I'll yield to Professor Nau. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I am wont to do, I am going to try to put the trade question into a little bit of perspective, both to understand the difficulties we face, but also to understand the enormous benefits we have gained from the kind of trading system that we established after World War II. The multilateral free trade component of our strategy after the end of World War II was perhaps the key to the evolution of the world that we see today. That is a world in which our former enemies are now fully recovered, prosperous, democratic countries. That includes, of course, primarily, first and foremost, Germany and Japan, but then also all of these other countries of Europe, which is now whole and free, and a couple of 2 or 3 very robust democracies now in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, where, by the way, there were no democracies before, no real democracies with opposing parties. I think a great deal, and then it goes well beyond Germany and Japan. It goes to all of the other countries, Portugal, Spain, Greece, countries that were not originally democratic but ultimately became democratic. It goes to the Asian tigers, which followed later in the 1970s and 80s, that is South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. Then it was applied, the multilateral free trade strategy was applied to other developing countries, the so-called newly industrializing countries, Philippines, Indonesia, Chile, a country, as Mr. De La Fuente has told us, that benefited from the liberalization of trade. At the beginning, many of these countries were not democracies, but later became democracies. Now, I can't say that that was a direct result of the multilateral, of the opening up of trade, but I think it was a critically important part of the opening up of other countries and the development of linkages, not just in trade, but also investment and later in finance, that brought these countries together, made them realize that they had a lot to gain in common, and that they could all gain from trade. Now, so I believe that open markets and freer trade, nothing is perfect, by the way, I'm not talking about totally free trade, but open markets and freer trade are, in fact, the way to go and continue to be the way to go. It has succeeded in some sense better than anything we might have imagined. Now, how has this come about? It's come about, I think, because we haven't recognized the real hero of this trade policy, which has brought so many benefits, economic and political. The real hero of that has been the American worker. The real hero of this entire period of opening trade and bringing countries into a prosperous and ultimately increasingly democratic world has been the American worker. think of what the American worker had to do in order to enable this trade policy. We were originally the manufacturing leaders of the world. We had all the clothing industry that you can imagine, and shoe industry, and when the black and white television industry came along, that was all located in America. We had big plants. You can see many of their shells today in New England and in the Midwest. We were dominant in many other areas like industrial commodities, steel, aluminum. Right after the war, we were the only country that had not been destroyed by the war, that is, internally. We were on top of the world in terms of trade. Our workers from that beginning in the late 40s have had to move progressively all across the United States, to the south, to the southwest, to the west, to the northwest, all over the country they had to move. That migration, I don't know that it has ever really been, I haven't seen a really good study, not that it probably exists, but a really good study that would trace that migration. Now, think about this. What other country would have a workforce that would have done the same thing, that would have been able to do the same thing, all right, to move from one area to another? I'm talking about the migration out of the industries. The shoe industry, for example, first went, to South Carolina, then it went to Louisiana, and then it went out to New Mexico, and eventually it went offshore. Of course, those industries eventually moved completely out of the country, and the American worker had to adjust to all of that, had to pick up his family or her family and move and find new skills, maybe work in the same industry for a while, but find new skills. An enormous contribution that was made by the American worker. What other country could have done this? What other country had that kind of flexible and entrepreneurial workforce? None. None. I could never imagine Japan doing this. I could never even imagine England doing it. Certainly couldn't imagine Germany doing it. Russia, China. Would these countries have done something like this? They wouldn't have. And therefore, I think that the real hero of this trade strategy, which I think has been very, very helpful, has been the American worker. Now, it was tough for the American worker, but in the end, it was also in the American worker's interest, because we have prospered through this whole period. We have gained dramatically over the course of the last 75 years, and we have elevated our middle class, and we've spread our middle class. And America is just much better off today with freer trade than it would have been with protected trade. Think about the country that tried to protect its trade after World War II. That was the Soviet Union. Tried to put the clamps on trade almost everywhere and direct it by government institutions. They, by the way, did preserve their jobs. Their workers did not have to move for 70 years, and then they lost all their jobs. And their workers were scattered all over the place until they were able to recover from the collapse of the state-owned, state-dominated system of trade that they created. So the American worker benefited, but was also the hero. I think what happened in the last 2 decades is that we finally pushed the American worker a little bit too far. We opened our markets to China, the last of the great countries that was, by the way, not democratic, and we were going to open our markets to them to try to help them become more prosperous and potentially more liberal. And we did that 20 years ago. And China flooded our markets. They accounted for less than 1% of our imports in the late 1990s. Today, they account for over 20% of our imports. This was a massive insurge, a massive inflow of products into the American economy. It had a very powerful impact on our industries and on our workers. And at some point, the workers pushed back. The American workers essentially elected Donald Trump, you could argue, in 2016. I'm talking about often many working class people who were Democrats and who traditionally voted Democratic. They went for Trump because they were experiencing things that, unfortunately, other candidates were not paying that much attention to, and they were experiencing this tremendous blowback from globalization. Now, does that mean that we should give up this trading system, or we should make some major adjustments in this trading system? I don't think so. I think we need to revisit many of the agreements, which is what President Trump is doing. Revisit many of the agreements that were negotiated at a time when China wasn't part of the world economy, and when we could afford to be more generous in opening our markets compared to what other countries were doing. And almost in all cases, I think there's a pretty good record of the fact that the American market was more open than the markets of Germany or Japan or you name it. So we need to adjust these agreements. And I think we're in the process of doing that. I think President Obama was starting to think about that. Certainly President Trump has put on the table now a whole series of agreements for renegotiation, as Ambassador Wilson has suggested. And now the real question is, who is Donald Trump? Maybe that's the question in all of our areas. Is he a free trader or is he a protectionist? Is he someone who believes that we all benefit if we can lower the intervention of government in the economy and on the borders, as we have been doing, and that there are lots of bumps in that, as Ambassador Wilson said, it's generally in our benefit to do so? Or is he someone who believes, we call this sort of a strategic trade person, that is in the literature, a person who believes that the more government intervenes and protects and leverages the markets, the better. The more we, for example, do what we thought Japan was doing back in the 1990s, where they were subsidizing their industries and stealing our technology, et cetera. Should we go ahead and do the same thing? Let's have a trade system based on governments increasing their intervention in the trading system rather than lowering the barriers to trade in their system. He's said things on both sides of the equation. But one thing we know, and I'll close with this point, one thing we know about Donald Trump is that he's a negotiator. That's what he's been doing all of his life. So I take the hope that he has initiated a series of negotiations, and he has undertaken a series of threats in the trade area, restrictions on trade in various ways, in various areas. He's done that as a way to set up negotiations in order to get some adjustment to these agreements. Now, there's some evidence already of that. He's been negotiating with Mexico and Canada. We hear that there are, in fact, some agreements that have been reached. We know that with South Korea, he's already reached some agreements, some significant agreements, by the way, reducing, for example, South Korean steel exports to the United States by 30%. South Korea is a major transshipment country for Chinese steel coming to the United States. China only exports about 2% of its steel directly to the United States, but it ships an awful lot through other countries. I should have left this for Ambassador Wilson to mention, but he has just indicated apparently in the last 24 hours that he might want to renegotiate, get back into the negotiations on TPP. He had said that earlier. He said, if I could improve TPP, I might, if we can get in there and make some improvements, maybe we'll go back into TPP. He said, but he said the same thing about the Paris Accords. But I don't think environmental issues are nearly as important to him as trade issues. So he's a negotiator, and I am hopeful that in the next 6 months we'll see some evidence of this kind of negotiating style. I think it would be very appropriate. It would give the American workers some breathing space. It would correct some of the imbalances in the trading system created when we were on top of the world and giving other countries a chance. They're now wealthy and prosperous. They can give us better access to their markets. And one thing that gives me great hope about Trump in this respect is the appointment of Larry Kudlow as his chief economic advisor. I know Larry Kudlow very well. He was actually in the Reagan administration when I was in the Reagan administration in the early 1980s. He's a free trader par excellence. And he's absolutely convinced that Trump is a free trader. But Trump won't say so. If he said so, how eager would the Chinese be to negotiate with him or any of these other countries? So, but the fact that Kudlow is there leads me to hope, at least, that Trump is exercising leverage by all of these import tariffs and other measures that he has announced, largely for the purpose of trying to get the attention of our trading partners and trying to negotiate some adjustments in these agreements that would benefit our workers and would potentially lower some of these trade deficits that we live with, over 500 billion, as Ambassador Wilson mentioned, with China. So on that optimistic note, let me end.
Thank you. Good afternoon, folks. I would like to start with the comments. As Professor Maskus mentioned, I'm more or less old-timer. I've been doing this for the past few years, but I gotta be very honest. Today, for the first time, I'm very nervous. The reason I'm very nervous because Keith Maskus was my PhD dissertation, and deja vu all over again, so I have a little bit stomach ache. So my hope is that I do not disappoint him too much, and I hope I prove it to him, and maybe to some of you, that I deserve that PhD. So, on that note, let me, by saying the next following things, that I have been in this country for almost 40 years. I left Iran in March 10th, 1977. But unfortunately, I have not seen so much uncertainty, so much fear, and so much division, and so much false information in this country, especially the past, say, 5 or 10 years. And there are a lot of misperception, misinformation about a lot of subjects. But I think it bothers me a great deal because I'm very passionate about my field of international economics. And I think I have a professional obligation to defend it. Now, the misperception we have about the trade, these days especially, if we are running a trade surplus, that's good, and we are winning. However, if we are running a trade deficit, that is bad, and we are losing. And I want to make this a statement. I'm sure you guys can relate to the person who made the following statement. Seems like you Americans by now are sick and tired of winning. So why that statement is not correct? Trade is not about winning and losing. Trade is about raising the productivity and the wealth of global economy, including the United States. I wrote my dissertation about a topic related to international trade at a fancy name called Heckscher-Ohlin model. Using human language or translated in human language simply says a country should produce and export the product that can use its abundant factor more intensively. In other words, you want to produce the product in the cheapest possible way. And I think the classical example is Canada has a lot of cheap energy, so it makes for Canada to produce a lot of aluminum. And I think it makes sense because it's much cheaper, and therefore it makes sense for United States to import that raw material from Canada. Even if you're running the trade deficit with Canada, there is really nothing wrong with that concept because the cheaper raw materials such as steel, aluminum, make our other products such as automobile, barbecue grill, and dishwasher much cheaper, and we're all going to be the main beneficiary of that. Another thing we have to remember, when we're imposing tariff and quotas on raw materials, such as steel and aluminum, those are the raw material that a lot of American companies use at home in order to produce a final product. We call it downstream industries. Now, before I go any further, I want to make sure that I'm consistent with my colleagues when we talk about the fair and free trade. Now, Ross was absolutely correct. Before China joined WTO, I believe it was in 1999 or 2001, I don't remember the exact time. When China joined the club, they promise that they're going to follow by all the international rules. There is no question that there are 3 areas that China is not following the TWO rules. One of them is transfer of technology. If you're an American company and you want to produce or sell your product in China, you are supposed to enter into agreement with China that you can allow a transfer of technology. In other words, the Chinese are going to have availability to American technology, and that clearly is a violation of the WTO. And when Chinese confronted with this violation, the response was following. Now, the American corporation, American company, when they decided to come to China and sell their product, they voluntarily agree with the transfer of technology. In other words, we are not pointing a gun at the American company, therefore there is no violation, which absolutely is nonsense, and I think this is an example of extortion. In other words, you're telling me the only way I can do business in China, I have to agree with the transfer of technology. Also, clearly there are some evidence that China's rate of economic growth has slowed down drastically compared to, say, 10, 15 years ago when they had a double-digit growth in their GDP or economic growth, and it's now, I think, probably around 5 or 6%. So they have a problem with the overcapacity. They're producing too much raw materials. One of it is steel, and I think, as I said, there is evidence that they're selling their product in American market or other markets below the fair market price, or as the economists refer to it, as a dumping. Also, the third violation is, again, more or less there are evidence that there is a currency manipulation. In other words, artificially lowering the value of their currency in order to make their export a little bit cheaper. So, having said that, I don't think imposing tariffs or other type of a restriction on raw material is going to be very effective and is going to be helpful for American economy, especially American workers. Now, some of my colleagues mentioned that during the election, it wasn't only Donald Trump who traveled to Midwest and the Rust Belt and told those unskilled and maybe less educated American that the reason you lost your job because of trade, because of Chinese. My beloved Congressman Bernie Sanders and Mrs. Clinton made exactly the same argument, which I believe is not completely correct. We use the element of fear during the election, and we blame wrong sources for the pain and suffering of certain American workers in this country, and really that's not fair. Now let me give you some example. Yes, there is no question that a certain American workers lost their job, maybe in Pennsylvania, maybe Detroit, Rust Belt area, Midwest, there is no question. And I can relate to her anger, I can relate to resentment, and I can see the resentment sometimes toward immigrants like myself. I can understand it. I got it. But I think, we shouldn't muddy the water and we should look at the facts. The problem with the trade, we have a tendency to underestimate the benefit of a trade. All of the skills, professional jobs that the trade create in this country, because the benefit of a trade is going to divide among the entire population of the United States. So it's not noticeable. It's not sexy enough for 6 o'clock news. But when we identify a handful of people in Detroit area or in Pennsylvania that they lost their job, then it is very clear that we can overestimate the cost the pain and suffering of trade. And at 6 o'clock news, we tell American population, see what happens. These people lost their job because of trade, or especially because of unfair trade, or because of the Chinese. That might be part of it. I'm not going to dismiss that right away. I'm saying that's part of it. And I give you the example, and I agree the Chinese are not following the rules. But there is the other side of the story. Part of those jobs, or most of the jobs, disappeared because of the change in technology. And we gotta be fair. And I think there are a lot of examples. Now, when you go to a grocery store, you go to self-checking area. So we used to have a lot of cashier. We have a lot of people did a lot of things. These are the lowest skilled, maybe less educated people. But now we are substituting machine for a lot of those jobs. Those jobs are disappearing. And I understand what happened to those people used to do it. But we forget. People need to design those machines, they need to service those machines, and we are creating a lot of jobs on those areas. So we got to be a little bit careful. And then another thing I want to say very quickly, when hopefully we have time, to explain something in details. And when we're talking about, yes, if we impose tariffs on steel and aluminum, definitely we're going to create or protect some jobs. But the question is, we're going to lose jobs in other industries that they're using those raw materials to produce a final product. And some economists estimate that for every job that we might protect in a steel industry, there are 40 related jobs that might be at danger. And let me give you another piece of statistics. So the steel mills that supply the raw materials would directly benefit from tariffs has been shrinking for years. Today, those industry employs fewer than 2,000 people. The companies that buy steel and aluminum to make everything from trucks, chicken coops, employ more than 6.5 million workers, according to the Heritage Foundation. So we gotta be very careful and not really brag that by imposing trade restriction, we protect few jobs there. There is a good chance we might lose additional job in other areas. So definitely we should look at the net effect when we impose this type of restriction. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Reza, and all of the panelists. We'll be turning to questions in a moment, but I'm told I have to read 2 slips of paper here. First, before we turn to audience questions, we would like to quickly mention the CWA 70th crowdfunding campaign. I'm sure you've all heard this. To celebrate the conference's 70th year, we have set a goal to raise $70,000. We are 1/4 of the way to the goal. So by my calculations, if anybody has $52,500 out there, send it to us. You can give by selecting the donate button in your app. Okay, so now, as far as Q&A is concerned, in this session we are using both the CWA app and a note card system. I've already received some questions on the app, so I'll be turning to those in a moment. If you want to ask a question in the app, turn it on, schedule, turn on this particular session, tap Q&A and insert and send your question. You can also raise your hand and request a note card and a pencil, and there are people here who can bring them to you. If you're going to write a question, make it short, please, and legible, particularly. Right, well, as I said, I did receive a few questions, which I'm going to turn to in a moment, but I'd like to start myself by turning back to the title of this session, which was, or is America First, Putting America Last? Or putting us last. I assume that means America. Let's try to see if we can focus on that for a moment. All of this discussion has been about trade, which is certainly a big part of this, but the United States also is engaging in rather new approaches to international relations. It's pulling out of negotiated agreements left and right. are we at risk of actually losing a position of leadership? I'll put that to you guys.
Well, I think I referred to that in my presentation when I talked about him not participating in the America Summit. I think that definitely it's a new tone. And I think that really, whatever goes on between the U.S. or America, I mean, I like to think America as a one continent, but the U.S. with other countries, I mean, economists have figured out that anything that relates at the end by trade, 5 points of any tariff raised between the U.S. and China would reflect in a decrease in the global GDP of 0.3 to 0.5%. So obviously, whatever the battle of aluminum, steel, and all the rest of the stuff happens here is going to bring and affect the rest of us. So obviously, this is definitely putting you in the last. So.
Any American policymaker at a certain level must put America first. It's almost axiomatic. America's security, America's prosperity, Americans' welfare has to be, had better be, at the top of any leader's set of priorities. And so at a certain level of generality, there's nothing wrong with that. The path that the administration is on isn't obviously one that's going to make us last. It is calling into question America's commitment to the international trading order to which Dr. Nau referred, that we created, that produces immense benefits for this country, and that risks then reducing American influence in continuing to shape the future of that international trading regime, and to some extent the broader international system, to the extent that there is one, in ways that will be unfavorable for our interests. It's early days. We're in the early, still barely into the second year of this administration, so there's a lot to play out. The symbols have been have disturbed both a lot of people in this country and elsewhere around the world, and created uncertainty for businesses that depend on the international trading system and the rules that the United States created, the agreements we have with others.
There's no doubt that if we implement the measures, the trade measures that are being tossed about, both by America and by other countries like China, that is, if we get into a trade war, then a policy of America first will in fact make us America last. We'll all lose. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think on the other hand, we need some adjustments in the system, and sometimes you have to break eggs to get those adjustments. You have to make your partners think you might impose these sanctions. Trump is very good at that, and we should be aware of the fact that none of these measures that he has announced, and by the way, the Chinese have announced countermeasures and so on, at least our measures can't go into effect for at least 3 to 6 months. They have to go through a process, and it's during that 3 to 6 months that I'm counting on these intensive negotiations that are going on that will ultimately result in America first, meaning we'll make some improvements, not to achieve a balance in our trade, because I agree with Reza that that's not good, but to eventually bring about new agreements that will promote trade and maybe even create new trade communities like the TPP. And it will be America first, but not America only in the end.
I have no problem for putting America first. Because if I'm a trade negotiator, or if I am dealing with another country in political terms, I want the best deal for my country. I want the best deal for my people. And I'm sure, if I'm dealing with a Chinese negotiator, they want exactly the same thing for our people. But what makes me nervous and sad a little bit these days when I keep hearing the term exceptionalism, nationalism. And I think it's spreading in other countries, as you folks notice. And if the United States decided to look inward and withdraw from all these treaties, we already, I think all of us, start in some extent criticizing China. We all have a mistrust in Chinese government. And we gave a good reason why we cannot trust Chinese. But if United States start concentrating on exceptionalism and nationalism and work inward, I think that's going to make the Chinese government very happy, because we're creating a vacuum, and Chinese said this is the perfect opportunity we get in. And I think there are a lot of examples. They're very active in Africa, they're active in Asia, and they are doing a lot of things. So I want to give a very cautious warning to American people. Then we cannot complain that the Chinese took over, and they're doing a lot of things and creating quote-unquote goodwill among other countries because we gave them the opportunity. Thank you.
So let me turn to a question that came in on the app. I want to embellish it just a little bit. One thing that really has not been discussed yet, and it's motivated by this question, which I'll read to you and then say just another couple of words. The question is this: if the American workers were heroes, and yet the wealth gap shows us they were also shortchanged, how does this trend get reversed? And I would add to that, wouldn't we think that the single biggest failing in American trade policy in this period has been an inability or an unwillingness to try to deal with the adjustment problems that American manufacturing workers have been facing?
Well, the second point was that we need better policies to facilitate the adjustment. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Look, I mentioned, and I think it's true, and I think that the American worker paid a psychic price for this trade policy that we pursued, but not necessarily an economic price until recently. This has been going on, for 50 or 60 years, and American workers have been moving out of the old industries into the new industries. Every time I see a delivery truck, a Federal Express truck, go down my street or something, I think to myself, that could be a former steel worker, or someone who was in fact engaged in one of these manufacturing industries that went way down in employment, picked up a job in a service sector. Used to get a little annoyed at our media, and especially in the 1990s, when they would report every job that was being lost in steel and automobiles and what have you, and would never tell you about all the jobs that were being created in, for example, the delivery industry. Lots of good jobs, by the way, very good jobs, pay well, much better than standing in front of a steel furnace for 8 or 10 hours a day. So in general, the American worker has benefited from this. But I think my point was that in the last 2 decades, we've really surged the system. And that we, by bringing China into the game without insisting that China follow the rules. And that has brought this surge of imports at a time, by the way, when we have been growing very slowly. And that's driven a lot of workers, they've lost their jobs, and then they've gone into the unemployed part of our economy, which doesn't even seek work. That number has gone way up. We have a 9 or 10% employment. If you look at people in the age from 24 to 52 who are unemployed but not seeking employment. Unemployment only captures those who are actually seeking employment. Those people are coming back into the marketplace now because we've managed to increase somewhat, at least in the short term, we've managed to increase our growth rate. We could sustain that for 2 or 3 years. That'd be very important in terms of absorbing more of these people in that unemployment class where they're not actually even seeking employment at this time. So I don't think the American worker has been disadvantaged in some permanent, ongoing, and long-term way. But my point was that in the last couple of decades, we've probably expected too much from the American worker, and they rebelled. That's one of the elements, at least in our current politics.
As an economist, I have been wrong several times, but this time, honest to God, I'll be delighted if I'm totally wrong and the 3 politicians who made the following promise to American workers Now, when they were elected, they're going to bring those jobs back home. Again, one of them was Donald Trump, and I'm going to be fair. One of them, Bernie Sanders, and another one was Mrs. Clinton. And honest to God, I hope I am wrong. And with all this trade, the restriction, we bring those jobs back to American. But I don't think that's the case. And what we are doing, I think, as a politician, maybe we don't have the courage to tell the truth, to talk about the reality. We keep postponing their pain and suffering by making empty, unrealistic promises. I think there is enough evidence. Some of this job, if not most of them, are not coming back. And it doesn't matter how much restriction we impose on Chinese and other countries. And I think there is some truth in that statement. Now, the better solution is come clean, say, look, it's a fact of life. It's not a pleasant thing to hear. But this is a reality. We got to make some fundamental changes for those people. There is nothing wrong if American corporation and American government get together and say, look, let's help these people. Let's maybe retool them, retrain them, and try to help them find a job that there is a demand for it.
So I'd like to combine a couple of questions, and I think address it first to Ambassador Wilson, since you have a lot of experience as a trade negotiator. First, let me put this one to you. If China is breaking the WTO rules, why isn't the WTO cracking down and punishing them? Why let them get away with breaking these rules? And then the second question, quite related, would be, do we really think that China is willing to engage and negotiate favorable terms in intellectual property?
So the first question, breaking WTO rules, why doesn't the WTO crack down? One simple answer is that's not the way the WTO works. The way the WTO works, and in fact the way the United States and others have conducted trade negotiations, at least since the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, is to agree mutually to a set of commitments to reduce tariffs and open markets to foreign goods. Exactly that kind of negotiation took place in the WTO context. For China, it had to sign on to a bunch of WTO rules. It had to make a whole lot of specific commitments to a number of key countries, including to the United States, that went either hand in hand or in some areas beyond the words on the piece of paper and what was already agreed in the WTO context. When those commitments get violated, the balance that was struck in a trade agreement, we'll give up this if you'll give up that, the balance gets undone. And in the WTO, when the balance is undone, the offended party goes to the WTO to complain. It presents its facts. A kind of international tribunal looks at those facts, and if it finds in favor of the offended party can take steps to right the balance, jack up tariffs on a range of goods that are of interest to us. So, for example, in the European Union slapped high tariffs or tried to ban American exports of hormone-treated beef in the 1990s. We believe that was a violation of WTO rules, or I think it was then the Uruguay round GATT rules. The case was found in our favor, and we slapped a whole range of tariffs on European goods. And after a period of time, things got fixed on the European side, and the balance was righted. That's the path that I think a lot of us think that the administration should have taken now with respect to China. In fact, there has been an explosion of WTO cases against China, both the filing of cases by offended parties, including the United States, European Union, and others, and a whole slate of judgments against China over the last 17 years, which interestingly, when China gets ruled against it, it has generally abided by the judgments and undertaken to correct the underlying problem. So anyway, that's how the system works. In my view, that's how the administration ought to have pursued it first and then moved into retaliation. It chose not to. On IPR, you know, the price of China's admission into on the scale that it is now in the international trading system is to abide by the rules. WTO agreements have fairly clear and explicit rules about intellectual property, and it's not unreasonable to suggest that when China, that something like 85% of the software that's used in China is pirated, it's largely American software, is pirated. When China accounts for in excess of 80% of the counterfeit goods that are found, that are seized at American ports of entry, there's a problem, and it's not unreasonable to suggest that that should be fixed.
Okay. I have one more question that was sent in. I quite like it. It makes a general point, but in an interesting way, so for the whole panel here. How is the loss of thousands of jobs by women employed by the telephone company any different from the loss of steel jobs? Those losses were also caused by technological advances. I don't recall an outpouring of concern. Was it because they were women's jobs?
Well, it's a great question.
No woman here to answer that question.
No women in the panel. Well, I think that one thing that I think using that point is that really, you know, trade and balances of trade usually governed by competitive advantage of countries. I think countries have to make the point of, you know, I'm not good at doing this, so let's find who around the world makes this better than I, and engage in trade agreements to get the best benefit of that. So I think that one of the issues that we have is that, you know, smaller countries than the United States have taken steps of totally have freedom of trade with many countries. I mean, up to 0% tax within all industries. And just be good at what they can be exactly the best at doing and export those products in retaliation. I think that the key thing here in the US, just like we see the disappearance of Kodak, you know, has been the lack probably of support of the government of retraining and giving opportunities for people to learn and to develop their competencies where the world is coming. You know, we had a big discussion at the beginning of this week, you know, with Tony Saba, opened everybody's eyes on the whole future of batteries and cars and everything that's going to happen by itself, and really how oil is not an issue anymore. So, you know, here one of the key top 10 issues of Put America First is to be, you know, dominant in energy and specifically in oil. Well, how relevant is what's going to happen in the next 5 years when, you know, you're going to need lithium and you need to start developing more electric batteries to support your transportation? I mean, I don't see that's a strategy. We're looking back instead of looking forward, and really I think we need to be more strategic on some of those decisions. So the issue with the women in the telephone companies is the typical thing. I mean, we didn't have the capabilities, or the US didn't have the capabilities to develop training and reformat his workforce to what is coming up. And I think we're still at fault in every country on that. We're always looking back and trying to resolve issues the forceful way instead of having a strategic plan.
That's my favorite question. And the reason for that, it indicates that women are very smart, they are flexible, they accept the reality, and they're willing to make the necessary adjustment. Today, women are entering, women are the fastest growing number of people in this country that they are involved with the highest skilled professional job. So they made the appropriate adjustment, and I see it at my college, the gap between the women and the gentlemen are rising. They're working very hard, they're smart, and they are able to get those skillful jobs. So I'm hoping as a steel worker, man myself, I show the same flexibility as women in this country and say, look, This is a reality. Those jobs are not going to be there. Therefore, I'm going to do the same thing that this woman did, and I think I'm going to say, that's, I think, the best solution to overcome some of the difficulties that we are facing when we say some American workers or steel workers are losing their job as a result of trade.
I want to second that. I think in many ways my wife is a heck of a lot more flexible than I am in both her work and at home. But I want to add another element of some optimism here. The bigger picture is that since the 1950s, we've employed an enormous number of women who are now permanently in the workforce. In the 1950s, less than a quarter of the women in the country worked. Today, 3/4 of the women in the country work. That's been a huge. We created those jobs, by the way, 50 million jobs just in the 1980s and 90s. Where did those jobs come from? Well, they came from the prosperity, from the economic growth that we generated. And we're still battling some issues here. Obviously, women's average wages, they're climbing, but they still don't compare with men. So I think that's one aspect that we should focus on. But in general, the economy has done extremely well in absorbing a large number of new women workers, as it has, by the way, minority workers, immigrants and Black Americans. We should be, I think, often more aware of how extraordinary our economy is with all of its faults.
Well, thank you. We've run out of time, so we'll have to step on. My apologies to the student who just sent in a question, but there's no time. Please join me in thanking the panel.